Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm pleased to be here today and joined by Senator Kaine. Senator Warner's on the way, Congressman Butterfield, Congressman Beyer. Good friend Hilary Shelton will be here presently from the Washington office of the NAACP to announce the introduction of the 400 Years of African American History Commission Act. This bill will establish a commission to begin the planning process and activities across the nation to recognize the many contributions of African Americans since the arrival of Africans in the English colonies at Port Comfort, Virginia in 1619. African Americans have contributed greatly to our nation, and their achievements deserve to be celebrated. The history of Virginia and our nation cannot be fully understood without recognizing the role played by the slave trade. Slavery was an important institution, but for hundreds of years, it was the foundation of the colony and early American agricultural system, and essential to its economic sustainability. The 20 Africans who arrived at Point Comfort in Hampton, Virginia in 1619 were the first on record to be forcibly settled into involuntary slavery in the English colonies. And the 400 Years of African American History Commission Act will be instrumental in recognizing and highlighting the resilience and contributions of African Americans since 1619. From slavery to fighting the Civil War to working through the oppression of Jim Crow segregation, through the Civil Rights Movement, the rich history of African Americans and their contributions to our nation began in 1619, but obviously did not end there. The commission established by legislation will be charged with the important task of The commission established by legislation will be charged with the important task of planning, developing, and implementing programs and activities throughout 2019 that fully tell the story of African Americans, their contributions, and their resilience over the last 400 years. The efforts of this commission will ensure that the legacy of the first African slaves, along with many other African American leaders whose contributions have helped move our nation forward, are recognized appropriately. It would be a great disservice, not only to African Americans, but also to all Americans if we failed to appropriately recognize this important milestone in our nation's history. I'd like to thank Senators Kaine and Warner for leading the charge in the Senate, and especially thank our other colleagues who have joined in supporting this legislation. It is now my pleasure to recognize my good friend and Senate sponsor of the legislation, Senator Tim Kaine.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you and good morning. I'm so thrilled to work together with my friend Congressman Scott and Senator Warner and our other colleagues here. You'll hear from Congressman Butterfield right after me, and then Congressman Beyer as well. And this very important bill, the 400 Years of African American History Commission Act. Why am I so passionate about this bill? When I was the governor of Virginia in 2007, we had a massive celebration around the 400th anniversary of the English contributions to the United States of America, beginning with the settlement of Jamestown in 1607. And it wasn't just a celebration. There was also a federal commission voted on, passed, and funded by Congress that was part of those events to say these contributions are worthy of recognition. As a senator last year in 2015, I played a role in the celebration about 450 years of the Hispanic roots of the United States with the founding of St. Augustine, Florida by the Spaniards in 1565. And I was in St. Augustine in September with the King and Queen of Spain to do that. Again, it wasn't just a celebration. It was a federal commission voted on, passed, and funded by Congress that said the contributions of the Hispanic settlement are worthy of recognition today. Well, if English lives matter, if Latino lives matter, then African American lives matter, and they mattered every day since the landing of those 20 and odd African Americans. That was the phrase that was used in the Bill of Lading at Point Comfort, Virginia in 1619. And that's what this bill is about. Now, the story is a very different story, and it's got a lot of pain associated with it. Not that everything was smooth for the English in Jamestown, not that everything was smooth for the Hispanic settlement in St. Augustine, but this is a unique story because it begins with people captured off a Portuguese slave ship and brought to this nation against their will. And those 20 were the beginning of what became millions who were held in slavery and then in second-class status. I was thinking about what 400 years from 1619 means, and I was kind of putting it in my own head this way. There have been 8 half-centuries in the 400 years, 8 half-centuries of history. For 5 of the 8 half-centuries, the Africans in this country were held in legal slavery. And even freed African Americans during that 5/8 of our history, who were not legally enslaved and treated as chattel rather than people, even freed African Americans were denied the constitutional rights that others had, were denied the rights of the Constitution, and denied even being citizens, according to the rationale of the Dred Scott decision. So that was 5/8 of our history. Then 2/8 of our history, from 1865 essentially to 1965, African Americans, though considered citizens now and not legally enabled to be enslaved, were held in a legally second-class status because separate but equal was the law of the land, whether it was in education, public accommodations, voting, service on juries, etc., for another 100 years. It's only been in the last 1/8 of our history as a nation, the last 1/8 of this 400-year period, that African Americans have been entitled to full and complete legal equality. But legal equality isn't everything, because if you look at the statistics about the wealth differential between Caucasian families and African American families, or disparities in the criminal justice system or elsewhere, you will see that there is a long, long way to go. So it's a story with a lot of pain to it, but it's also a story that has to be told in a way to commemorate that we as a nation, had it not been for 400 years of African Americans, you cannot think of anything. The United States would be absolutely unrecognizable and so much poorer in so many ways, artistically, entrepreneurially, intellectually, academically, culturally, diplomatically, spiritually, in every plane of who we think of ourselves when we think of Americans. The United States of America, without the contributions and influences of African Americans, beginning with that tragic landing at Point Comfort, America would be unrecognizable and much the poorer. And so what we hope to do with this bill, and it's certainly my hope that Congress would respond to it the same way they responded to a bill to recognize the English contributions or the Hispanic contributions, is to engage in something we should do periodically, especially around momentous anniversaries, which is tell the story and tell it in a way differently than it might have been told 50 or 100 years ago, taking advantage of the ability to tell it more and more truthfully, just like we hope those who follow after us will tell it even better than we're able to. And that's what this bill is about, and I'm really proud to work together with my colleagues on it, and I'm now happy to introduce to you the head of the Congressional Black Caucus from North Carolina, G.K. Butterfield.
Thank you, and good morning, one and all. Let me begin by thanking my colleagues, both from the Senate and from the House, for their support of this legislation, and thank you for the incredible work that you do in your own respective chambers regarding not only issues that pertain to the African American community, but issues that pertain to all Americans who want to move this country forward. I am indeed the chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus. There are 48 African Americans who serve in the United States Congress. 46 of those choose to belong to the Congressional Black Caucus. And so I bring greetings to you on behalf of at least the 46 members of the Congressional Black Caucus. and thank you for coming today. Collectively, we represent more than 30 million people in this country, hailing from 22 states, plus the District of Columbia and the Virgin Islands. And so we are about serious business. And what we are talking about today is part of our agenda. I talk about slavery and the antebellum period in churches and places all across the country almost every month. This is a subject that I care so deeply about, and I will not go through the 30-minute presentation that I normally give to audiences, but I will summarize what this means, at least to me. Slavery indeed began in 1619 in the Commonwealth of Virginia. You've heard that story today, but it persisted and continued for 245 years. Some say it ended in 1863 with the Emancipation Proclamation. I'm not a proclamation student. I am a 13th Amendment student. I believe that slavery legally ended in America on December 6 of 1865 when it was ratified by the 27th state. The 13th Amendment was ratified by the 27th state, the state of Georgia. And so in December of 1865, 245 years of slavery and involuntary servitude came to an end. During the antebellum period, we had 4 million slaves. The 1830 census says there were 2 million, which means that the slave population actually doubled. Even though the legal importation of slavery had ended back in 1808, the slave population had doubled between 1830 and 1860. And so when 1865 came along, there were 4 million people in bondage. There was another group of blacks called free people of color, 330,000 of those across the country who by one means or another had achieved their freedom by various means. And for some, their master freed them at their deaths. Others purchased their freedom, and others got their freedom in various ways. But when slavery came to an end, 4 million slaves, with the stroke of a pen, became free. They had no money, they had no assets. The only thing they had was faith in God, faith in community, faith in family, and faith in their government, that their lives would improve. And starting in 1865 was a period of Reconstruction. African Americans across the South were doing great things. The 11 states that seceded from the Union returned to the Union. As a condition of return, they had to give the former slaves the right to vote, and that came along in 1870. And so that was a glorious period. 20 African Americans were elected to Congress, yes, Congress during the period of Reconstruction. But all of that came to an end in 1900. In 1900, that's when the Congress of the state legislatures across the South passed literacy tests and poll tax legislation that prohibited African Americans from voting. And so the voting period came to an end in 1900. And for the next 45 or 50 years, African Americans did not participate in a meaningful way, I would say for the next 65 years, in a meaningful way in the political process in this country. But in 1965, the Voting Rights Act was signed into law. And starting in 1965, African American communities, and all of us know this story, began litigating voting rights cases across the country. And now African Americans are elected to office all across the South, notwithstanding the fact that there are some in this body who want to turn back that progress. But we're going to continue to fight that fight. So I want to thank you for coming today. Thank you for the great interest that you have in this subject. The only piece that I left out was a law passed in 1830, at least in my state, and I presume in other southern states, that made it a crime for a free person of color to teach a slave to read and write, made it a crime for a free person of color to preach the gospel to a slave. And the punishment for said crime was 20 to 39 lashes on their bare back for teaching a person to read and write or imparting the gospel to the slave population. And so we've come a long ways in this country. It's a stain on American democracy, but thank God we are united now and we are moving forward as a nation, and we enlist your support and your help as we continue to face the challenges of the future. Thank you so very much for coming.
Good morning. Good morning. I want to thank Mr. Butterfield for his leadership in the Congressional Black Caucus. I want to thank my good friend and my Congressman, Don Beyer, for his efforts. But I want to particularly thank two of the people that I'm closest to in this challenge around politics, friends of 30 years, Bobby Scott and Tim Kaine, for their leadership. There would be no American history story without the full story of the contribution of Africans and African Americans to our combined history. And I can think of nothing more appropriate than taking this moment and starting now to create this commission, a federal commission, that would celebrate this story. Tell the good and the bad. We know, having a governor before Tim and all the Virginia delegation, we spent enormous amounts of time, energy, and resources to commemorate 2007 and the founding of Jamestown. That was an important part of American history. But equally important is the story of what happened starting in 1619 and has continued for the last 400 years in America, of the enormous contributions, sacrifices that have been made by African Americans. Butterfield made mention of the fact that we have seen now, post-voting rights, contributions of elected officials, African American elected officials in the Congress, in the executive. At local level, we've got Ms. Tweedy and Mr. Chapman here from local elected office in Virginia. And we celebrate that. But I often think about when I was governor, in the 21st century, not in the 19th century, not in the 20th century, in the 21st century, it took us 2 tries in the Virginia legislature to provide some level of compensation for those individuals that were turned away from public education facilities in the 50s and 60s in Virginia during the actions of massive resistance. When literally Virginia schools shut their doors rather than allow black children to be educated next to white children. So this is, yes, a story that goes back to the landing of 1619, goes through the periods of slavery, but this is still a story that was very much present in the 20th century, and quite honestly, the fact that it took 2 tries in the state legislature in the 21st century, and as Tim mentioned, in terms of economic inequality, in terms of criminal justice reform needs, it's a story that we need to continue to talk about, study, and frankly, get better at. And I can't think of a better opportunity than creating a federal national commission that would focus from the both looking back perspective historically, but equally important, looking forward about how we create a more perfect union that includes all Americans of all backgrounds, of all creeds, colors, and religions. And with that, let me, I introduced him this way earlier. I don't know whether he appreciates this, but I've known him as well for 40 years. The most aggressive, ambitious, 65-year-old freshman in the House of Representatives, my Congressman Don Beyer.
Good morning. It's a great pleasure to be here, although I confess as a humble freshman in the House of Representatives, I've never been on the Senate side. Your rooms are really small. They're really big. You know, it's a great honor to be here with men that I love and I respect. And this great thanks to Bobby Scott and Tim Kaine for putting this together, and to be here with GK and Mark and Hilary. You know, most of us here are Virginians. And Virginia has the worst history. I mean, those slaves in 1619 came to Virginia. Both capitals of the Confederacy were Virginia, Richmond and Danville. The Confederate Army was called the Army of Northern Virginia. In the 1950s and 60s, it was Virginia had the massive resistance. They closed Prince Edward schools, et cetera. I mean, all the worst parts of this history were right here. So it is so wonderful to see the balance, that it is Virginians leading this effort. I was trying to get ready to answer my colleagues on the other side of the aisle in the House about why they should support this, because I know they're going to say, what's there to study? Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that American culture is so importantly integrated with the contributions that African Americans have made to the culture. And let me just pick out 7 ways. Number 1, economics. The economics of this country, first driven by slavery, but then by the end of slavery, by the Great Migration, by so many things that African Americans have affected our economy and our economic growth. Second, the law. Some bad stuff, Dred Scott, Plessy versus Ferguson. Some good stuff like Brown versus Board of Education. But the history of American law is the history of decisions affecting African Americans. Language. Won't even begin to it, from okay to everything else. I mean, our language is more full of African phrases than it is of French. Music. The blues, jazz, Motown, R&B, et cetera, et cetera. Sport, from Michael Jackson to Tiger Woods, from Jesse Owen to Jerry Rice, every part of our sport has been affected by African Americans. Public service. Martin Luther King, Barack Obama, Frederick Douglass, Douglas Wilder, Bobby Scott, G.K. Chesterton, and John Chapman. I mean, it goes on and on, the number of African Americans who have affected our public life. And then, maybe most importantly for me, spirituality. Because, you know, America's still supposed to be the most religious country in the world. But the most religious part of the most religious country in the world are our African American communities of faith and of spirituality that drive much of the morality in the rest of our culture. And we're just beginning. I'm so looking forward to the next 400 years and the impact that you make on us. 400 years without slavery, with ever slowly increasing.
400
No, 40 years, 40 years. So if Black Lives Matter, the Black lives of the last 400 years really matter, and I'm so glad that we're going to be able to study them. And I'm happy to be part of this. And it's my great honor to introduce Hilary Shelton, who leads the NAACP here in Washington, D.C. Hilary.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Senator. I also want to thank Senator Kaine, Senator Warner, Congressman Scott, Congressman Butterfield, Congressman Beyer, and all the members who have worked so hard on this important legislation. It's important that we understand each other's history as well as our own, and the commission established by this bill allows us to do just that. Not that long ago, too many people of our nation were of the opinions that people of African descent had no discernible history, at least not fully integrated into American history. Thus, too much of our history was lost, forgotten, ignored, or otherwise fragmented and overly simplified. The work of pioneers, including Carter G. Woodson, John Hope Franklin, Dorothy Porter at Wesley, Henry Louis Gates, Dr. Lonnie Bunch, and so many others who have too often been relegated to an addendum at most. Sadly, their seminal work has never been fully integrated into the history of the United States of America. I work for an association that is steeped in history. In fact, tomorrow is a holiday for the NAACP community throughout our nation and the world as we commemorate our Founders' Day. It will be 107 years ago tomorrow that a brave and visionary group of men and women, including renowned scholar and historian W.E.B. Du Bois, who I believe was the first Black person in the world to earn a PhD in history from no less than Harvard University, founded the NAACP. The commission to be established by this bill will hopefully provide us with the opportunity to understand the struggles with which we are faced today in the context of the challenges which African Americans have faced and the splendor of our heritage. It is my hope that the result of this commission will provide us with the full context and a much more seamless continuum of our history. Yes, the transatlantic slave trade is a crucial and important part of the African American experience, as were the Black codes, Jim Crow, segregation, lynching, over-incarceration, police misconduct, and income inequality today. Yet that is not our full story. It is time that that full story is unveiled, that full story is told. It is also important that we all know that even as the bill we are supporting now begins in 1619 with the initiations of arguably America's most peculiar immigration program, the transatlantic slave trade, that we know that Juan Garrido, the first person of African descent who was documented to have come to the New World in 1508, more than 100 years earlier, Juan came as a free man, a conquistador, who arrived on what is now considered to be the island of Hispaniola, and who settled in Puerto Rico. Juan later joined Ponce de Leon on his search for the Fountain of Youth, becoming the first Black man documented to have come to the United States, exploring Florida in 1513. It is my hope that this federal commission, with access to all the records and histories of the past, will be able to tie everything together so we can better understand how we got to the 20-odd slaves who landed in Port Comfort, Virginia in 1619, to the, quite frankly, the CBC member, or the dean of the Congressional Black Caucus that came from the streets of Detroit, or the young man from Wilson, North Carolina, who came to lead the 46 other African-American members of Congress, or the former NAACP branch president, who serves as the ranking member of the House Committee on Education and the Workforce, or even the kid from Hawaii, who went on to become a U.S. Senator and then the first African-American president of the United States of America. This legislation could not have come at a better time. And it's my hope that this commission will work closely with the new Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture as well as the United Nations, which has declared 2015 through 2024 as the International Decade for People of African Descent. In fact, I recently testified before the United Nations Working Group of Experts of People of African Descent regarding many of the challenges facing African Americans today. In its initial report, which was issued late last month, the working group found that, quote, the persistent gap in almost all of human development indicators, such as life expectancy, income, wealth, levels of education, and even food security among African Americans and the rest of the U.S. population reflects the level of structural discrimination that creates de facto barriers for people of African descent to fully exercise our human rights. It is crucial that this part of American history is fully uncovered, researched, analyzed, and shared as a comprehensively interwoven thread in the fabric of our great nation's history. As such, I once again would like to thank the originators of this legislation, as well as its supporters, and especially those who have come out here today to express their vision and hopes. We at the NAACP are looking forward to working with you to pass through the Congress this crucial legislation, to see it go to the White House and signed by that first African American president of the United States. So thank you very much.
All of us are glad to take questions.
Kelly?
Congressman, good to see you, Senator, and Mr. Shelton. In 1999, I had the pleasure of going to Benin, West Africa, and had an interview with President Matthew Carriacou and President Gerald Rawlins of Ghana, the two principal slave trading nations during the transatlantic slave trade. Then followed that back to Jamestown. And I guess my point is, at that time, they apologized for the misdeeds of their ancestors, not initiating the slave trade, but for perpetuating it, trading valuable souls for valueless goods. I wanted to know that as this commission moves forward, it's a two-part question, will you be able to reach out to those countries so that they can also talk about how they have asked for forgiveness and reconciliation with African Americans in order to move forward?
I think that's the point of having a commission. You can get all of the professional input. That this the celebration will not be designed by a bunch of politicians, but people who have a good, solid background in history, and that would obviously be part of it.
You talked about spirituality. It's a very key, important thing that I will never forget. I would be remiss not to repeat it because it kind of sanctioned me to do it. And that was President Matthew Carriacou. He said, whenever you have a chance to speak to America, particularly African Americans, let them know that we value them. We see them as modern-day Josephs who helped build the global economy we enjoy today. And when I went to Jamestown to follow up on that story, it struck me that the curator of Jamestown said it would not have worked without the contribution of the African Americans. So looking at today and the particular problems we have today, how do we get that message out that we are viewed as modern-day Josephs, sold into captivity by our own, but triumphing to become contributors to the global economy that we certainly enjoy?
Great question, and I hope that that's what this commission will do. We've worked closely with Dr. Bunch at the Smithsonian and with the NAACP. We really appreciate their help as we put this together, because if we tell the story right, the fact that African Americans have built the economic foundation of the country in the ways that Congressman Beyer mentioned, that will be part of it. And I do think the opportunity for dialogue between the U.S. and the African nations, Richmond, my home city, has done an interesting dialogue between African nations, Richmond, which was an epicenter of the slave trade, and Liverpool, where most of the slave traders' businesses were operating. And we have this Liverpool, Richmond, Africa triangle that has been really focused on understanding and learning over the last 15 years. So this will create some wonderful opportunities, and much in the same way. I hope we say to congressional colleagues, if they ask why, because you thought it was important enough to do it for the English. And you should have. That was important. And you thought it was important enough to do it about the Hispanic contribution. And you should have. It was important to do that. But if it was important enough to vote and do a federal commission for the English and the Spanish, then you've got to do it. You've got to do it for Africans and African Americans and the contributions they've made. Please, yes,
Yeah.
and then we'll come here.
Quick
please.
question. Setting up this commission, I'm James Wright with the Afro-American newspaper. Setting up this commission, every year we talk about the same African-American heroes, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, et cetera, et cetera. Will this commission focus on the everyday African-American, the everyday slave, the everyday free person, just the everyday African-American?
Sure, I can say, speaking very specifically to the legislation in the bill, it gives us an opportunity to tie all those issues together, to also look at the impact that the experience of the transatlantic slave trade has brought us up to this point. That's extremely important. What the commission will allow us to see in context is how these issues, whether it's the black codes, segregation, whether it's our failing school system or our problematic criminal justice system, all that impact affects African Americans in a very unique and sometimes peculiar way. So with that in mind, the commission has an opportunity to look at all those issues. But being lodged here at the federal government gives us an opportunity to tie all these pieces together. And I think that's extremely crucial. There are many great volumes that are written about various chapters in African American history, even before the Mayflower, if I can borrow from Lerone Bennett. But all those pieces are very, very helpful. Tying those together with a commission like this could prove to be just invaluable, not only to our community, but also the rest of the world.
Let me just add one thing, and I think there's also an opportunity here. You mentioned individuals of great note that have already been celebrated, but and Don mentioned some of the challenges in Virginia, but I remember I was governor and my daughter walking around Capitol Square, and she'd been studying civil rights. She was second grade at this point, and she's looking around, and all the statues at that point on Capitol Square were all dead white males, most of them, many of them of Confederate heritage. And she goes, you know, where's Rosa Parks? And my wife was thinking quick. She said, well, Rosa Parks not from Virginia. That lasted for about 10 minutes, but that then moved us to the story, which I'd heard before, but, you know, a woman who candidly would have been a couple of years older than me, Barbara Johns, who as a teenager in a decrepit high school in Prince Edward County in Moton High School, against the recommendation of the more established African-American leadership in the community, said, we're not going to take this anymore, and led to a walkout that, but for the way the cases were filed, would have been maybe the name case in Brown versus Board of Education. So there are incredible stories, particularly as we see young people now transform the political landscape. I think there's a piece here of telling stories, not just every day, but stories of heroes that might not be on everybody's lips and simply in Black History Month or in other normal recitations.
Please.
Do you know at this point how much the commission could cost?
We are going back and digging into the records around the Jamestown Federal Commission and the St. Augustine Federal Commission. The Federal Commission expenditures are not significant. Often the communities of Williamsburg or the town of St. Augustine would do all kinds of things and, you know, kind of add to it, but the actual commission expenses are not that great. But I don't have a figure to give you today. I do know from having worked with them that they were funded, but the funding was not huge. Please.
Senator, Congressman, first of all, thank you very much for this piece of legislation that you're pushing. By the way, Eric Claville, Hampton University. I served on the State Commission of Virginia, 1619-2019 Commission. And with that, we pretty much have the same goal when we're looking at the first arrival of the first slave Africans here. My question is there an opportunity for the State Commission of Virginia to work with the Federal Commission and vice versa? And if so, how do you foresee that?
The structure of the legislation allows the appointment of individuals, and certainly the appointment of some individuals connected with the Virginia commemoration of Point Comfort is contemplated. And so I do think there's a strong opportunity. And the State Commission is interesting because in Virginia, 1619 is not only the arrival of Africans, it's also the beginning of the General Assembly, the longest meeting legislative body in the world. And that there's that interesting thing between the people arriving and the legal structure being created that over time created the American institution of slavery, and that would happen in the same year. That has a kind of a, I don't know, irony isn't quite the right word, but there's powerful kind of image that's created by that. That's going to be a wonderful commission, and yes, working together with Virginia and other states would be a key goal. Maybe time for one more, please.
How you guys doing? Tyler Times from Huffington Post. There seems to be a lot of conversation about the upliftment of Black people and Black bodies, especially now. But is there any emphasis or reason why you chose right now to do this commission? Why not earlier? Why not later? What's the importance of doing it now?
Well, it's 3 years in advance. It's for 2019. That gives us 3 years to work on it. You don't want to wait much longer because you won't have the time to work with other commissions, other groups, much more before. It's just not timely. So I think 3 years is an appropriate time to put all the work together to set up the celebrations and recognitions for 2019. And I think, again, it's important that this is done by a commission. If politicians were trying to do it, we'd be restrained by what's politically popular. Professional historians can tell the truth.
And wouldn't it be a great signal in a year that is filled with so much political strife and where candidly the expectations of us in Congress getting a lot done, this is something we can get done quickly, fast, and has been mentioned earlier, it'd be great to have President Obama sign it this year.
Thank you all so much. Really appreciate you being here.